Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to meet here and study your word. Help us to understand how you use the right people in the right places to spread the good news well beyond Palestine, which ended up coming here and causing us to be here in your service. We thank you for all these things. Amen. Okay, pick up your map there. First of all, I want you to notice, look at all those lines and see how far this guy Paul actually got. I mean, look at the bottom. It's like that's 300 miles. So you're talking almost 1,000 miles of walking and sailing and riding on the back of a horse or a cart or something. And you can see how those lines are all intercrossing each other. First of all, the dark blue line was the first journey. That's over on the right. You can see how he goes from Antioch to Cyprus and through that part of Galatia. Then the second line is that, I don't know what you call that color, almost an orange. You can see he really goes around and through that same area and then expands his territory, if you will, all the way through Greece. And then the third missionary journey is that purple line, and basically what he's doing there is he's kind of checking on how all these other lines are doing. And then we're going to be talking about that fourth line, which is the green line. Take a good look at that. He's supposed to be going to Rome, and you can see he sort of takes a roundabout way to get there. And we're going to find out what that roundabout way is. There's a whole lot of events that occurred along the way that nobody expected. So, take that home and look at it. Also, it says, see those dots with the other, what looks like an orange dot around it? And it says the 7 churches. Anybody know what that refers to? I mean, that's where they are, but they're all in Asia there. Well, one of these days we're going to study the book of Revelation, and in the first 3 chapters he talks about the 7 churches. Those are the 7 churches he's talking about. And you remember from the tape they mentioned that this is one of the 7 churches. Well, that's what they're talking about. Okay, so you can see this guy Paul, for somebody who has some sort of they thought he might have epilepsy. They thought he's been stoned, beat up, kicked out, roughed up, and everything else. Guy got around, and it's absolutely, when you look at it from this point of view, it's absolutely amazing. There is only one thing in our country's history that even comes close. Anybody know what it was? There was a group of individuals called the Circuit Riders, and they would just put a Bible on a saddlebag and just take off. And they went out into the frontier anywhere they could, and would just stop and take their Bible out of the saddlebag and preach, and then move on and keep going around. And that would be the only thing that comes close to what you see here. And when I look at it even today, I'm amazed at how far this guy got without modern transportation. And so you can also tell, and I'm trying to build a timeline for you, that he didn't exactly do this in a month and a half. It took quite a while to walk all this distance. And so we're talking about years worth of work. And the tape, the acts and the tape make it go through like it's a few days here and there. That's not true at all. I mean, you're going to find when Luke is involved, he tells you how many days he walks from A to B and B to C and C to D and so on. But the rest of the time, we don't really know. All right, put that aside. Now, from the last study we did, the first question is, why did Paul, remember, Paul had a chance to go back to Ephesus and he didn't do it. Why did Paul decide to go past Ephesus and leave it alone?
Because they ran him out.
Yeah, they ran him out of town.
He got kicked out.
They're still mad at him. And then finally, at the end of the study, Paul was in Miletus, and he brought in all the elders of the church. Anybody remember why he did that?
Was that because he said that was the last time that he was gonna see them, so it's kind of like passing the torch, so to speak?
Precisely, that is exactly why. So, he's saying goodbye to them in a way, because he suspects something, that we're gonna find out, exactly what that something is. So, let's begin, what we call the voyage to Jerusalem. Would somebody please read Acts 21, verses 1 to 16?
Hello.
Okay, go ahead.
And I'll just mention that one line, the second one, that's called melon. A combination of pink and orange. I'm sorry, 21 point. After we had torn ourselves away from them, we put out to sea and sailed straight to Kos. The next day we went to Rhodes and from there to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, went on board and set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. We landed at Tyre, where our ship was to unload its cargo. Finding the disciples there, we stayed with them 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. But when our time was up, we left and continued on our way. All the disciples and their wives and children accompanied us out of the city, and there on the beach we knelt to pray. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship, and they returned home. We continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where they greeted the brothers and stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed out at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." When we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Nason, where we were there to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples.
You get the idea that the folks didn't want him to go? I think that's pretty clear, isn't it? They know what's going to happen, okay? Everybody has some idea. Now, to be sure, the head of the church was in Jerusalem. That's true. What I never could figure out is how do I want to say this? How they were able to stay alive in what we're about to read. Kind of a mode of behavior that's going to jump up out of nowhere for Paul when he gets there. But the fact of the matter is, that's where the head of the church was. Everybody figured, well, he'd be safe there. All he has to do is just say, I'm part of the church, and we'll protect you, and all this other kind of thing. But we're going to find out that's not exactly what happened. Things were got a little bit out of hand. That's putting it mildly. The other thing that remember that Paul is going to Jerusalem for another reason. Anybody remember what it was?
It wasn't some type of religious holiday.
Well, that's part of it, but the other reason was, remember he had asked for a collection, and he's bringing the money with him. That's why he has an entourage, because I don't know about you, but I don't think they had paper money back then. So money usually was very heavy, and it took a lot of people to carry it around. So he's got people that are bringing all of this stuff into the city and the town, towns around it, and so he's not coming alone. There are other people with him, but they certainly know who he is. And this is what's going to cause this next segment, which is Acts 21 from 17 to 26. Would somebody like to read that for me?
I'll read it.
Okay.
When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men and join in their purification rites and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everybody will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. For as the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from foods sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them.
Okay. What's going on here is, remember, Paul was a Roman citizen, but he was also Jewish. And he studied to be a rabbi. So he knows the rules, okay? He keeps saying that you don't have to follow the law, but at the same time, these people are kind of like, we were talking about this in Bible study the other day. It's kind of like a deathbed confession, where people live their lives, and may not have been a great life, from a moral standpoint. But on their deathbed, they say, "Accept me, Lord." And what does everybody else say? "That's not fair. I went to church all these years. I did this, I did that." No, that's not. You come along and say that they can just say that. No, that's not fair. Well, a lot of Jews were saying the same thing. That yes, we went through all this stuff. Okay? We did all of the festivals. We circumcised our kids. We went through all of these rituals and everything. Now you tell us that we didn't have to do that? You can imagine there might have been a few people a little upset about that whole thing. By the way, purification, here's what that was all about. This is from William Barclay's commentary. He says, "The leaders saw a way in which Paul could guarantee the orthodoxy of his own conduct. That is, he's still a Jew. 4 men were in the middle of observing the Nazirite vow. This was a vow taken in gratitude for some special blessing from the hand of God. It involved abstention from meat and wine for 30 days, during which the hair had to be allowed to grow." Okay? It seems that sometimes at least the last 7 days had to be spent entirely in the temple court. At the end, certain offerings had to be brought: a year-old lamb for the sin offering, a ram for a peace offering, a basket full of unleavened bread cakes for the fine flour mixed with oil, and a meat offering, and also finally a drink offering. Finally, the hair had to be cut and burned on the altar with the sacrifice. It was obvious that this was a costly business. Work had to be given up, and all the elements of the sacrifice had to be bought. It was quite beyond the resources of many who would have wanted to undertake it. So it was considered an act of piety for some wealthier person to cover the expenses for someone taking the vow. This is what Paul was asked to do in the case of these 4 men, and he agreed. By doing so, he could demonstrate for all to see that he himself still understood and observed the law. So, this is the kind of stuff, when Paul says following the law, we're talking about here. Then he says, there can be no doubt that this matter was distasteful to Paul. For him, the relevance of things like that had gone by the wayside. But it is the sign of all who are truly great that they can subordinate their own wishes and views for the sake of the church. There is a time when compromise is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. So far, so good. Now, they haven't bothered Paul yet. He had just done all of this. He's been in the temple. They know he's there. So maybe, just maybe, things are going to be all right. Well, don't count on that. I would need right now somebody to read Acts 21, 27 to 36.
I'll go. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us. This is a man who teaches all men everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." They had previously been seen Psalmist and Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. The whole city was aroused and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the riders saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Away with him."
Things got a little nasty, didn't they? So it went from, here I'm doing a good thing, to the opposite, just like that. And notice what it says. It says they were people from Asia. It had to have been some sort of a festival that drew them there. And they knew who he was. And immediately the mob turned on him. These were people that just the day before had seen him in there and doing all the things for these 4 guys and everything else. And all of a sudden, boom. Remind you of somebody?
Sounds like Christ.
Yeah.
They did the same thing to him.
Yeah, they did the same thing to him. So the difference is, Paul was a Roman citizen, which means he had protection from the Roman guards. And this was so important for him, because Paul is going to use his Roman citizenship from this point forward to do a lot of ministry, even though, quote, he's been arrested.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Since he was a Roman citizen and had protection, how come the Roman soldiers still flogged him?
Well, that's,
How was he protected from, all that kind of stuff?
well, the Roman soldiers weren't beating him, the people were.
But they chained him and put him in barracks.
Yeah, that's, they chained him and put him in barracks because that way, it's the only way they could keep the people from stop bothering him.
Yeah.
But I thought in,
In Jesus' case, yes. Jesus was not a Roman citizen.
no, what I mean is, he was brought before one of the Roman,
Okay, that's because at the time they didn't know he was a Roman citizen, and when they found out, it's like, whoops! See, they weren't supposed to do that. And in this case, this makes the whole story, all right? In fact, here's what happened. It so happened Paul's compromise led to disaster. It was the time of Pentecost. Remember somebody said there was a festival going on? You did. That's right. Pentecost was there, so all kinds of pilgrims were there, and there were a bunch of Jews from Asia. Look at your map and see where Asia is. They're not from around the block. It took them a while to get there. That's that green section almost in the middle towards the top. So, they had seen Trophius the Ephesian. This guy must have been known, okay? And he must have been a known Greek because they said, well, if Paul's here, he's here, and therefore he violated the rules, let's get it. Notice it says nobody actually saw him in the temple, but they just assumed that he was there. And then it says, these certain Jews no doubt knew how effective Paul's work in Asia had been. They had seen Paul in the city of Trophius, whom they probably knew. The business of the vow had taken Paul frequently into the temple courts, and these Asian Jews assumed that Paul had taken Trophius into the temple along with him. Trophius was a Gentile, and for a Gentile to enter the temple was a terrible thing. Gentiles could enter the court of the Gentiles, but between that court and the court of the women there was a barrier, and into that barrier were insert tablets with this inscription: no man of alien race is to enter within this balustrade and fence that goes around the temple. If anyone is taken in the act, let him know that he has himself to blame for the penalty of death that follows. Even the Romans took this so seriously that they allowed the Jews to carry out the death penalty for this and only crime. Remember, we talked about that when I handed out the picture of the temple. You could see the wall there. The Asian Jews accused Paul of destroying the law, insulting the chosen people, and defiling the temple. This was, remember what this temple was. This thing was huge. It was the place where God lived. Remember, God lived in the very center, the Holy of Holies. That's where God was. And remember, only one person was allowed to see him. Who was that? The high priest, and not every day. So, now, as it turns out, in the northwest corner of the temple stood the castle of Antonia, built by Herod the Great. At the great festivals, when the atmosphere was electric, it was garrisoned by a cohort of 1,000 men. Must have been a huge place. Rome insisted on civil order, and a riot was unforgivable sin for both those who staged it and the commander who allowed it. That's why Pilate was walking on eggshells. Okay? It doesn't sound like he's there now. Sounds like this is someone else. The commander heard what was going on and came down with his troops. For his own sake, talking about the commanders, and also Paul's own sake, Paul was arrested and chained by each arm to 2 soldiers. In the confusion, the commander was able to extract no coherent charge from the excited mob. And Paul was actually carried through the seething crowd into the barracks. There was never a time when Paul was nearer to death than this, and it was the unbiased justice of Rome which saved his life. Imagine this. Remember, this is a walled-in area. This is not, you know, you've got a whole lot of people in there in a very small space, so it doesn't take long for a mob to get going. You know, you remember flash mobs?
Mhm.
Yeah, that was the idea behind those things. You know, you put a bunch of people in a small space, and then all of a sudden they rise up out of nowhere. Okay, well that's what it must have been like. And unlike any other mob I've ever heard of, half the people that were yelling and screaming probably hadn't had the foggiest idea why.
Mhm.
That's what happens once mob rule takes over. Everything, you know, all things go up. And remember, now it's maybe like 300, 400, 500 against 1. How one lasted as long as he did is surprising to me. I mean, it'd be like yelling fire in a crowded theater. So you get the idea now. Paul sort of suspected something like this was going to happen. But I'll bet he figured that the Romans would act just as they did. And that's what's going to sustain him the rest of this, quote, last journey. That's that line on the way to Rome, the bottom line in your map. You can see he takes a whole lot of side trips. And he's under arrest this whole time. But keep in mind, when he takes a side trip, he just doesn't sit there and read the paper. He uses this as a teaching moment. So he gets a lot of teaching done while all these things that are going to happen to him occur. And so Paul was not dumb. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so this is why, like I said, he was warned, he did this, he did that, as Jesus was warned. Remember, there are biblical scholars who believe that Jesus was only in Jerusalem maybe twice in his whole life. That his ministry took place in Galilee. That way he was away from people like this. And so it all comes down to the simple fact that I had to do something the right way, and this guy is telling us we don't have to do that. Well, we can't stand for that, so therefore, let's get him. And that's what they tried to do. And if you remember the description of Paul, he wasn't a big guy anyway. So this whole event tells you that even though Paul has evangelized all over that area, he still had many, many, many enemies. Now keep in mind one other thing. This is about 60 AD when this happens. 10 years later, there's another riot, and this time it wasn't contained, and the Romans basically leveled the city and tore down the temple. And that's what led to, I don't know if any of you saw the movie years ago, Masada. You know what Masada is? Masada was a fortress that was built by Herod. It's on top of a mesa in the mountainous area there. And there was only one way to get up there. Basically they had built a sort of like a basket elevator. That's how you got up there. And what happened was the rioters all ran to Masada and put themselves up on top of this mesa, and the Romans couldn't get at them. So what the Romans spent 2 years doing was building this bridge to get up there. And when they got up there, they found out the whole group had committed suicide.
Oh, jeez.
So to this day, when Israeli soldiers are commissioned, they're brought up to Masada to do it. It still exists. You can still see it. But so, you know, this is what happens when riots start. So the Romans made to make sure that nothing like it wouldn't get that far, because if it ever did, and Caesar had to act, a whole lot of bad things were going to happen. So now you get the impact of what's happening here, and let's see what our tape says about it. First of all,
The meander.
now you know where a meandering river comes from.
traditional landing place for Paul on the island of Rhodes is this natural bay, now called St. Paul's Bay. There are many natural wonders in the Aegean Sea, and this is one of them. A narrow opening in the rocks where ships can enter and be completely protected from storms. Paul returned to Palestine, his third missionary journey drawing to a close.
That's about what a boat would have looked like.
They arrived in the city of Patara and changed ships. They found one bound for Phoenicia. Patara today is imprisoned by sand dunes. The dunes run up the coast for miles in every direction. A triumphal arch has the inscription, Patara, the capital of the Lycian nation.
Think they like their theaters?
We can clearly see the ancient harbor here in Patara, the harbor where Paul would leave one ship and go aboard another, bound for Caesarea in Palestine. Paul is almost murdered in Jerusalem. The zealots want him put on trial, but the Roman military commander rescued him and took him to Caesarea with an escort of 200 Roman soldiers. "I want to go before Caesar for my trial," he says. This amazed the Roman governor Festus because Paul had committed no crime. "To Caesar you shall go," he said. The prisoners were under the command of the Senate.
Paul requested a trial by Caesar. A Roman citizen could do that. Now, stop and think. If any Roman citizen could do that, what do you think Caesar's docket might have looked like? He also knew that because he wanted to be tried by Caesar, he'd have to wait a couple of years before his trial would come up. So we will see he uses that to his advantage. So Paul knew how to use his Roman citizenship as well or better than anyone else could have. And that is extremely important in this story.
Is that why he kind of got privileges during his captivity?
That's right. So basically, as I said, he's waiting for how shall I say this? He's waiting for his day in court. And like I said, he knew it was going to be a while. Now, when he's under house arrest, he's chained to a chair or something. There's a guard there, but basically anybody could have come and gone. And we'll get into that a little later. But what the tape didn't tell you, and I'm going to read this one from the Bible I have, Acts 27:37 to 40. What Paul says when he gets on the steps of the barracks. Remember, they took him to the barracks to get him out of trouble. And he's on his way up the steps. And then he says, when Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" He said, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not then the Egyptian who some time ago started a revolution and led 4,000 men of the dagger bearers into the desert?" Paul said, "I am a man who was a Jew, a native of Tarsus, a citizen of no mean city. I ask you, let me speak to the people." When he had been given his permission to do so, Paul stood on the steps and made a gesture with his hand to the people. When a great silence had fallen, he spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue. So imagine this. I know when you're in Boy Scouts, when you do that, everybody shuts up. I don't know what he could have done. Okay, he said, and then he gestured his hand. you know, went like this or like that. Somehow he got these people to shut up. And they want to kill him, so they're going to shut up. And then Acts 22, 1-10 says, this is what he said. Men, brethren, and fathers, listen to the defense which I now make to you. When they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they gave him still more quietness. So he said, I am a Jew, I was born in Tarsus, I was brought up in this city. I was thoroughly trained at the feet of Gamaliel and the law of our fathers. I was zealous for God, just as all of you are today. Interesting. Just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way to death, fettering both men and women and delivering them to prison, as the high priest and the body of the elders bear me witness. I received letters from them, and I went to the brethren at Damascus to bring those who were there in chains to Jerusalem, that they might be punished. As I was on my way, when I was coming near Damascus about midday, suddenly it happened to me that a great light from heaven shone around me. I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I answered, Who are you, sir? And the voice said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, who you are persecuting. Those who were with me saw the light, but they did not hear the voice of the person who was speaking to me. I said, What am I to do, Lord? The Lord said to me, Stand up and go to Damascus, and there you will be told about all the things that have been assigned to you. Now, he's telling the crowd this. I don't know how they would have reacted to that. What would you say? I mean, he's telling them, hey, I was on your side, now I'm on the other side. What would that be like today? What's going on Tuesday? Elections. That'd be like changing parties. Right? That'd be like changing parties. All of a sudden, I was there. Now I'm a Republican. What do you mean you're a Republican? That's what Paul is telling them. He is trying to explain who and what he is, as if they didn't know. Think about that, as if they didn't know. He could have said, you know my story. I mean, that's why you want to beat me up, right? Instead, he goes back all the way to the beginning. So what did he just do?
He explained his conversion, but it also kind of sounds like in the Bible when they start from the beginning all the way to Jesus.
Right. He in today's terms, he somehow turns this fiasco into a teaching moment, doesn't he? He turns it into a teaching moment. And somehow it works. I mean, if that was me today, they'd probably still be throwing stuff at me. Tomatoes, who knows, but somehow he turns it into a teaching moment. That was what Paul's ministry was all about. He always looked for the teaching moment in every situation. Think about that. He always looked for the teaching moment. Even when they were going to beat him up, put him in jail, remember when he's in jail, what does he do? He teaches the jailer, doesn't he? Think about that. This guy had that unique capability of taking any situation and turning it into a teaching moment. And if we recall from our studies, sometimes somebody would pay attention to it and hear the good news for the first time. He could have, when all this stuff happened, he could have said, I'll get out of town, or put me in jail, leave me alone, or whatever. But he always looked for the teaching moment. And he did that right here, after they almost killed him. So, next week, we're gonna find out, what happens after this, and what happens when the journey starts, to Rome. That is a fabulous story. I mean, it's almost as if, the powers, it's almost as if the higher powers never wanted him to ever get there. I mean, when you hear the story of what happened to him, you'll understand what I mean. But Paul was determined. He was gonna get there no matter what, and we're gonna see what he does to make sure he gets there. That's kind of amazing. All right, almost time.